Friends and history enthusiasts, good day. Today we are going to delve into the very heart of desperation, into that point where engineering genius intersected with the abyss of military collapse. We will take apart, bolt by bolt, centimeter by centimeter of armor, one of the most terrifying and effective defensive systems of the Second World War. We are not talking about the famous tigers or panthers racing across the fields, but about their immobile, blind, and deaf twin brother, which became a nightmare for thousands of soldiers. This is not a story about blitzkrieg, but about its agony. It's the story of how to turn a tank into a concrete grave, and turn that grave into an impregnable fortress. Don't switch away, it's about to get intense. And yes, subscribe to the channel, you won't find such deep dives, with analysis, economics, and vivid details, anywhere else. Write in the comments which other wonder weapon of desperation you'd like to hear about next time. Let me tell you a story that began not on the drawing board of an inspired designer, but in the soul-chilling roar of Soviet guns in the east and the growing thunder of Allied armadas in the west. This is 1943, and then 1944. The Third Reich, that seemingly unshakable colossus, had developed a deep crack. Its strategy, a lightning strike, crushing the enemy in one giant cauldron, no longer worked. The war transformed from dynamic, mobile warfare into positional, exhausting war of attrition. And Germany was beginning to lose this war of attrition. Try to see the situation through the eyes of a German general. The panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, are exhausted, depleted. There aren't enough of them to plug all the holes in the gigantic front stretching from Norway to Italy. The enemy has overwhelming superiority in the air, in manpower, in the production of steel and shells. What to do? Retreat? But there is nowhere to retreat. Germany is behind. They must hold. But with what? The answer was a turn to fortification, to stubborn, static defense. Everyone has heard of the Atlantic Wall, the grandiose, almost mythical line of fortifications along the entire coast of France. But few think about the insane price it demanded. Thousands of tons of steel, millions of cubic meters of concrete, the labor of hundreds of thousands of people, including forcibly brought workers. It was a colossus on clay feet, devouring the last resources of a dying empire. But the front wasn't only on the coast. Italy, the Eastern Front with its endless expanses, everywhere, strong points were needed. But there was neither time nor materials to build giant concrete casemates like in the First World War. And here, the organization tote enters the scene, the industrial fist of the Nazi war machine, the very structure that built the Autobahns and the West Wall. Its engineers were given a task that sounded like a technical paradox: to create a maximally powerful defensive point. It had to be A, lethally dangerous to any enemy armor, B, relatively cheap and fast to produce, C, compact and inconspicuous, D, autonomous, so it could be defended by a minimal crew. The solution they found was brilliant in its monstrous simplicity. Why build a complex gun emplacement from scratch, design special guns and mechanisms for it? We already have a ready-made, perfect tank killer, the turret from the Panther, the PZ, KPFW. V Panther tank, one of the best, if not the best medium tank of that war. Its long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun was a true masterpiece of ballistics. It tore turrets off Shermans and T-34s from ranges at which they couldn't even hope to penetrate it. Thus, the idea of the Pantherturm, Panther turret, was born. Essentially, it was a hybrid of a tank and a permanent fire point, pillbox. Take the head of the Panther, its turret with the formidable gun and all its sighting equipment, and mount it not on a mobile chassis, but on a steel or concrete cup, dug deep into the ground. Let's pause and consider the economic and industrial context. By 1944, German industry, despite all the efforts of Speer and total mobilization, was in a vice. Allied bombings methodically knocked out factories. There was a catastrophic shortage of non-ferrous metals, quality steel, fuel. But the production of Panthers and spare parts for them was established. And importantly, damaged tanks accumulated in repair units and warehouses, tanks whose chassis might be hopelessly mangled, but whose turrets remained intact. The Pantherturm became the perfect way to utilize this valuable resource, to give it a second, terrible life. This was a weapon of recycling, a weapon of desperation, born from the wreckage of former might. The design itself is an example of German pedantry and attention to detail, even in the hell of total war. The Pantherturm was two-story. Imagine a steel cube, an armor plate 100 millimeters thick. This is the upper combat compartment. It was almost completely submerged in the ground. Only the turret itself protruded, and even that they tried to sink as deep as possible. On this armor plate, the ring on which the turret rotated, was mounted. Inside, racks with ammunition. And not 20 or 30 rounds, but up to 450. This was a whole warehouse of death, designed for long autonomous combat. And beneath this steel cube at a depth of up to 6 meters, was the lower living compartment. Its walls were thinner, about 70 millimeters, but this was enough to protect the crew from everything except a direct hit from a heavy shell. It was a veritable underground micro-world. There were bunks for the 3-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, that's all, no more needed. A stove to avoid freezing in the frozen ground, an electric generator. But the most important detail, the compressor. Here we need to make an important digression. A tank turret is not an artillery casemate. After a shot, it's full of powder gases. In a tank, this was solved by ventilation or simply an open hatch. But in a sealed, buried steel box, these gases had nowhere to go. After a few shots, the crew could simply suffocate or be poisoned. Therefore, the compressor, which forced clean air and purged the barrel after each shot, was the #1 life support system. Without it, the Pantherturm turned into a gas chamber for its own crew. The first models, the so-called Pantherturm I, had a serious flaw. The turret was rotated manually. This was painfully slow. Imagine. The gunner, sweating and straining, turns a handwheel to swing the multi-ton turret towards a new threat, while enemy infantry is already flanking. The problem was solved with characteristic German inventiveness. They installed a small gasoline engine into the fighting compartment, the same one used in cars and motorcycles. It powered a hydraulic or electric turret traverse mechanism. This same power plant worked the vital compressor and the dynamo for lighting. It became a closed, autonomous little world. Start the engine, and you have light, air, and the ability to quickly aim the gun. This was the Pantherturm III, brilliant and terrifying. But iron and concrete are only half the success. The other half is tactics and camouflage. The long, nearly 2-meter barrel of the Panther was an excellent aiming point for enemy artillery and aircraft. Therefore, they worked on the position as if it were a work of art. The turret was surrounded by sandbags, earth, peat, tree branches were woven into its outlines, camouflage nets were stretched. The goal was to break up its clear, recognizable silhouette, to dissolve it into the terrain. Often the turret peered out of the ground literally up to its shoulders. To detect it, you either had to stumble upon it point-blank or see the flash of its shot. And after firing, a smart crew immediately reversed, and the turret lowered into the well for reloading, disappearing from view. It was precisely this tactic that earned the Pantherturms their blood-chilling fame on the Apennine Peninsula, on the so-called Hitler Line. The Italian front was ideal for them. Mountainous terrain, narrow valleys, limited space for maneuver. Here, the mobility of Shermans and Churchills meant nothing. They were forced to assault well-camouflaged positions head-on. One episode went down in history. During the breakthrough of the Hitler Line in May 1944, a single Pantherturm covering a key road, within minutes, turned 13 heavy British Churchill tanks from the North Irish Horse Regiment into blazing wrecks. Imagine this hell. The first tank explodes, blocking the road, the others try to turn around to find the invisible enemy, and from the slope of a hill, from a distance of a kilometer, an invisible, deadly lightning strikes again and again. Piercing the frontal armor of a Churchill was no problem for the Panther's gun at such a range. The Allies suffered monstrous losses. To destroy such a point, they had to get within pistol-shot distance at 300 meters and aim for the vulnerable commander's cupola or vision slits. Often, this cost the lives of several crews attempting it. Even artillery bombardment with 155mm shells was often useless, the concrete well or steel cube withstood a direct hit. But, like any static defensive structure, the Pantherturm had fatal flaws. It was blind. Its field of view was limited to what the commander could see through his periscope. If enemy infantry, using the folds of the terrain, approached from the flanks or rear, the turret became a trap. It could be grenaded through the embrasures, set on fire with gasoline, blown up with a demolition charge. The crew's life depended on their own infantry, which was supposed to cover the dead zones. By the end of the war, around March 1945, about 268 such installations had been built, according to various sources. Most on the Western Front and in Italy. There were almost none on the Eastern Front. Why? The answer lies in the different tactics of warfare. The Soviet war machine of 1944 to 1945 was a steamroller. A breakthrough in defense was achieved not by frontal attacks, but by concentrating monstrous artillery and air power on a narrow sector, followed by the introduction of tank armies into the breach. A static Pantherturm in such a situation would simply be quickly outflanked and left deep in the rear of the advancing Soviet troops. Its fate was sealed. In the West, however, where the terrain was often more constrained, for example, in Normandy with its bocage, hedgerows, and Allied tactics were more cautious, Pantherturms could show their full terrible potential. In Germany itself, during desperate street fighting, turrets from Panthers, and even from the formidable King Tigers, were placed at intersections, embedded in the ruins of houses. But without careful camouflage and infantry support, they quickly became targets for grenadiers and sappers. So, in the end, the Pantherturm is the apotheosis of defensive thinking. It is a symbol of the moment when Blitzkrieg finally ran out of steam, and Germany, like a cornered beast, began to build its last lair. It is a weapon of desperation, but a clever, calculated, lethal desperation. It did not save the Third Reich, nothing could save it anymore. But it clearly demonstrated how tactical ingenuity and engineering genius could, even in conditions of total collapse, create tools of incredible efficiency, forcing the enemy to pay the highest price for every step forward. It was the last desperate move in a lost game, an iron flower that bloomed on the dung heap of a disintegrating empire. It did not stop the spring of 1945, but it left scars on the memory of all who encountered it. That's the story. A story not about victory, but about stubbornness. Not about glory, but about survival. A story about how, even at the end of everything, you can create something that inspires terror. It makes you think, what drove those three men sitting in a steel box underground, knowing that sooner or later they would either be outflanked or crushed? Duty? Fear? Professionalism? Probably a bit of everything. And what do you think about this phenomenon? Could such defensive systems, if built in much greater numbers, have seriously slowed the advance? Or was their fate predetermined from the start? Write your opinion in the comments. Argue. Share your thoughts. That's the most interesting part of our dialogue. And of course, if such deep analyses with immersion into economics, tactics, and human fates are to your liking, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. Ahead of us are stories of other weapons of desperation, from the flying V-bombs to the ghostly electrobullets. I promise it will be no less fascinating. Until our next meeting in history.